The envelope sat on his desk, unopened for 3 days. Inside were DNA test results for his 3 children. When he finally tore it open, his hands trembling, the words on the page destroyed 15 years of his life in an instant. None of them were his. Not James, not Sophie, not even little Emma. His wife had built their entire marriage on a lie, and what he did next would ensure she'd never forget the consequences. Michael Richardson had always considered himself a rational man. At 42, he ran a successful architectural firm in downtown Seattle, pulling in a comfortable 6-figure salary that afforded his family a beautiful home in the suburbs. His wife Catherine stayed home with the kids, managing the household while he provided. It seemed like the perfect arrangement, the American dream wrapped in a white picket fence. The cracks started showing 6 months ago, though Michael didn't recognize them as cracks at the time. Catherine had become distant, her phone always face down on the counter, her laptop password protected with a code he didn't know. She'd started going to the gym more often, buying new clothes, wearing perfume on random Tuesday afternoons. When he asked about it, she'd smile and say she was just taking better care of herself. He'd believed her because why wouldn't he? They'd been together since college, married for 15 years, built 3 children together. Trust was the foundation of everything they had. The real unraveling began on a Saturday morning in March. Michael had taken James, his eldest at 13, to a basketball game. Sophie was at a friend's house, and Emma, only 7, was supposed to be at a dance recital rehearsal. But when Michael and James returned home early because the game had been cancelled due to a power outage at the arena, they found Catherine in the living room on her phone, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. She startled when she saw them, quickly ending the call and forcing a bright smile. Michael noticed the flush in her cheeks, the way her hand shook slightly as she set the phone down. James, oblivious, ran upstairs to his room. Michael stood in the doorway, studying his wife's face. He asked if everything was okay, keeping his tone casual. Catherine responded too quickly, claiming she'd been talking to her sister about their mother's birthday party next month. But Michael knew his sister-in-law had been in Europe for the past 3 weeks. Catherine had complained about it just yesterday, annoyed that her sister was unreachable during her vacation. The lie was small, probably meaningless, but it lodged in his mind like a splinter. That night, after Catherine had gone to bed, Michael found himself doing something he'd never done before. He picked up her phone from the nightstand, his heart pounding. The screen was locked naturally. He tried their anniversary, then Emma's birthday. On the 3rd attempt, using James's birthday, the phone unlocked. His hands shook as he opened her messages. There were the usual mom group chats, texts with her sister, with her mother. Nothing suspicious. But then he noticed a messaging app he didn't recognize, hidden in a folder labeled Shopping Apps. When he opened it, his blood ran cold. The messages went back years, conversations with someone named Marcus, filled with intimacy that made Michael's stomach turn. There were photos, plans to meet, declarations of love. But what shattered him completely was a message from 2 months ago where Catherine had written that Michael still didn't know about the kids, that he was never supposed to be their father anyway. Marcus was. He always was. Marcus had asked when she would tell Michael. Catherine had responded that she just needed to figure out the timing, maybe after Emma's birthday, because she didn't want to ruin it for her daughter. Michael sat there in the darkness, the phone's glow illuminating his face as his entire reality crumbled. He read through months of messages, piecing together a story he'd been too blind to see. Catherine and Marcus had been high school sweethearts. They'd broken up before college, and Catherine had met Michael during freshman orientation. But she'd reconnected with Marcus 5 years into their marriage, and the affair had been going on ever since. The children. His children. He did the math in his head, his mind racing. James had been born 9 years into their marriage. Sophie, 2 years later. Emma, another 4 years after that. If Catherine was telling the truth in those messages, then Marcus had fathered all 3 of them during their affair. But how was that possible? Michael had been there. He'd been present for every conception, every pregnancy, every birth. Unless Catherine had been seeing Marcus at the same times, unless she'd deliberately created situations where she could claim the children were Michael's while knowing they might not be. He spent the rest of the night in his home office, staring at the wall, trying to process what he'd learned. By the time dawn broke, he'd made a decision. He needed proof. Real, undeniable proof. DNA tests for all 3 children. Only then would he know the full extent of Catherine's betrayal. The next day, Michael called in sick to work and drove to a private DNA testing facility across town. He explained his situation to the counselor there, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who'd probably heard 1,000 similar stories. She gave him collection kits and instructions. It was simple, really. A cheek swab for each child and one for himself. Mail them in, wait 2 weeks for results. Getting the samples from the kids was easier than he'd expected. He told them it was for a family tree project he was working on, something to surprise their mother. James rolled his eyes but complied. Sophie thought it was cool. Emma made it into a game. None of them knew they were participating in the destruction of their family. Those 2 weeks were the longest of Michael's life. He went through the motions, pretending everything was normal. He kissed Catherine goodbye in the mornings, asked about her day in the evenings, helped Emma with her homework. But inside, he was hollow. Every time he looked at the children, he saw strangers. Every time Catherine touched him, his skin crawled. He started preparing just in case the results confirmed his worst fears. He met with a divorce attorney, a shark of a woman named Diana Ross, who specialized in high-conflict divorces. When he explained the situation, her expression remained neutral, but her eyes gleamed with professional interest. She warned him that if the tests came back showing he wasn't the biological father, they could argue for fraud, no child support, no alimony, and go after Catherine for every penny she'd taken from him over the years. But she also warned it would get ugly. Very ugly. Michael told her he didn't care. Catherine had destroyed his life, and he wanted her to pay for it. Diana nodded and said they'd make sure she did. Michael also met with a forensic accountant, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who spoke in clipped, efficient sentences. Within a week, the accountant had traced every dollar of their joint finances, identified every asset, and created a detailed report of their financial life. Michael learned things he'd never known, like the credit card Catherine had opened in his name 2 years ago, running up $20,000 in debt that he'd been paying off without realizing it. The accountant pointed out that Catherine had been siphoning money through small amounts that Michael wouldn't notice. But over 5 years, it added up to about $80,000 going into an account under her sister's name. Michael felt the rage building, hot and dangerous. Catherine hadn't just betrayed him emotionally. She'd been stealing from him, planning her exit, probably with Marcus waiting in the wings. The envelope arrived on a Monday. Michael had been working from home that day, and when the mail came, he saw the return address from the DNA testing facility. His hands shook as he carried it to his office and closed the door. He sat there for hours, just staring at it. Part of him didn't want to open it. As long as he didn't know for certain, he could still cling to some shred of hope. But hope was for fools, and Michael was done being a fool. When he finally tore it open, the first thing he saw was a summary page. The results were listed in stark clinical language. James Richardson showed 0% probability of paternity. Sophie Richardson showed 0% probability of paternity. Emma Richardson showed 0% probability of paternity. Additional testing indicated all 3 children shared the same biological father, and it was not Michael Richardson. He read the page 3 times, 4 times, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something different. But they didn't. They just sat there, black ink on white paper, destroying 15 years of his life. Michael didn't cry, he didn't scream, he didn't throw things or punch walls. Instead, he carefully placed the results back in the envelope, put the envelope in his desk drawer, and locked it. Then he called Diana and informed her he had the results, and that she'd been right. None of them were his. There was a pause on the line. Then Diana's voice came back, sharp and focused. She told him not to tell Catherine anything yet, not to let her know he knew. They needed to prepare everything first. She asked if he could come to her office tomorrow morning. He confirmed he would be there. That night, Catherine made his favorite dinner, pot roast with roasted vegetables. The children chattered about their days. Emma showed him a drawing she'd made at school, a picture of their family holding hands under a smiling sun. Michael looked at it and felt nothing. He told her it was beautiful, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. After dinner, after the kids were in bed, Catherine curled up next to him on the couch. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he forced himself not to pull away. She told him she loved him. Michael replied automatically that he loved her too. The words tasted like ash. The next morning, Michael met with Diana and her team. They'd already prepared preliminary divorce papers, pending the DNA results. Now they revised everything, adding fraud claims, demands for reimbursement, requests for full custody with no visitation. Diana was thorough, vicious even. Michael appreciated that. Diana explained the plan. They would serve Catherine at home, but not until they'd secured all Michael's assets. She'd already filed emergency motions to freeze their joint accounts. The judge had granted them based on the evidence of fraud and theft. Catherine would wake up tomorrow to find she had no access to money. Michael asked about the kids. The question felt obligatory. He knew he should care, but right now all he felt was rage. Diana admitted it was complicated. Michael had been their legal father for their entire lives. The courts might still order him to pay child support, even with the DNA results. But they would argue that Catherine's fraud negated that obligation. It wasn't guaranteed, but they had a decent shot. Michael asked if they could go after Marcus. Diana smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. She confirmed they absolutely could. Alienation of affection was still valid in their state. They would sue him for damages. Even if he didn't know about the fraud initially, he definitely knew later. Those text messages proved it. Over the next week, Michael executed his plan with military precision. He moved all non-frozen money into a separate account Catherine couldn't access. He changed the passwords on everything: email, social media, Netflix, the cloud storage where they kept family photos. He cancelled her credit cards. He transferred ownership of the family cars into his name only. He also installed cameras around the house, hidden in smoke detectors and picture frames. He wanted to document everything that happened once Catherine discovered what he knew. His attorney had advised it, saying that Catherine's reaction might be useful in court. On Friday evening, Michael came home early with the divorce papers in his briefcase. Catherine was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The kids were in the living room, watching TV. It was a scene of domestic normalcy that Michael was about to detonate. He called Catherine into his office, his voice calm but leaving no room for argument. She followed him, looking confused and slightly irritated. Michael closed the office door behind them and locked it. Then he walked to his desk, pulled out the DNA results, and placed them on the desk between them. Catherine picked up the envelope and asked what it was. Michael told her to open it. He watched her face as she read the results. The confusion morphed into shock, then fear, then something like panic. Her hands started shaking. The papers fell from her fingers, scattering across the desk. Catherine started to say she could explain, but Michael cut her off. He told her he'd read her messages with Marcus. He knew everything: how long she'd been cheating, how she knew the kids weren't his, how she stole $80,000 from him, how she'd been planning to leave him and take everything. Catherine's face went white. She pointed out that he'd gone through her phone, her voice rising in accusation. Michael confirmed he had, and he'd found years of lies. He pulled out the divorce papers and informed her she was being served with divorce papers, as well as lawsuits for fraud, theft, and emotional distress. Marcus was being sued for alienation of affection. Her accounts were frozen, her credit cards were cancelled. She had no access to money, no access to cars, no access to anything. Catherine's voice rose to a shriek, insisting he couldn't do this, that those were her kids. Michael's voice remained cold as he corrected her. They were Marcus's kids, and she was going to have to figure out how to explain that to them. Catherine lunged for him, her hands reaching for his face, but Michael was ready. He stepped back and she stumbled. Outside the door, the kids could be heard asking what was wrong. Michael unlocked the door and opened it. James stood there, looking worried. Michael looked at the boy he'd raised, the one who wasn't his son, and felt the rage crystallize into something harder, colder. He told James that his mother needed to tell him something, then turned back to Catherine. Catherine was crying now, mascara running down her face. She begged Michael not to do this to them. Michael replied that she had done this to them and she could tell them the truth or he would. What followed was chaos. Catherine, sobbing, tried to explain to three confused, frightened children that Michael wasn't their biological father. James, always the smart one, put the pieces together quickly. His face hardened in a way that reminded Michael painfully of himself. The boy asked his mother if she'd been lying to them their whole lives. Catherine tried to say she was protecting them, but James cut her off, demanding to know what she was protecting them from. From knowing the truth, Sophie started crying. Emma didn't understand what was happening, only that everyone was upset. Michael stood apart from it all, watching like a spectator at someone else's tragedy. That night, Catherine packed a bag and left. Michael had made it clear she wasn't welcome to stay. She went to her sister's house, taking the kids with her. Michael was alone in the house for the first time in 15 years. He poured himself a whiskey and sat in the dark living room, listening to the silence. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it just felt empty. The legal battle that followed was brutal. Catherine's attorney tried to argue that Michael was still legally obligated to the children, that DNA didn't matter after 15 years of acting as their father. Diana countered with the fraud argument, presenting evidence that Catherine had deliberately deceived Michael, had stolen from him, had planned to abandon him once she'd taken everything she could. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, listened to both sides. When it came time for her ruling, she looked directly at Catherine and delivered her verdict. She stated that what Catherine had done to her husband was unconscionable. She'd committed fraud on a massive scale, not just emotionally but financially. She'd deceived him into believing he was the father of 3 children who were not his. She'd stolen money from him. She'd carried on an affair for over a decade. The court found in favor of Michael Richardson on all counts. Catherine's face crumpled. Her attorney tried to protest, but the judge held up a hand and continued. Michael Richardson was under no obligation to pay child support for children who were not biologically his and who were conceived through fraud. However, he could choose to maintain a relationship with them if he wished. That was his choice, not Catherine's. Catherine would repay the $80,000 she stole plus interest. She would cover all legal fees, and she would have no claim to any assets from the marriage. Catherine nodded through her tears, understanding the terms. The lawsuit against Marcus was settled out of court. He agreed to pay Michael $200,000 in damages and to take full financial responsibility for the 3 children. Apparently, Marcus had a well-paying job in finance and could afford it. Michael didn't care about the money. He cared about making Marcus understand that there were consequences for his actions. As for the children, Michael struggled with what to do. James refused to speak to him, aligning himself firmly with Catherine. Sophie was confused and hurt, caught between her mother and the man she'd always known as her father. Emma, too young to fully understand, just cried and asked when Daddy was coming home. Michael's family was divided. His parents thought he was being too harsh, that he should forgive Catherine for the children's sake. His sister supported him, but worried about the kids. His friends mostly sided with him, though a few called him heartless for cutting off children he'd raised for years. One evening, about 2 months after the divorce was finalized, Michael's doorbell rang. When he opened it, Sophie stood there, small and alone. She asked quietly if she could talk to him. Michael let her in. They sat in the living room, the same room where everything had fallen apart. Sophie told him that her mum said he hated them now. She asked if that was true. Michael took a breath and told her he didn't hate her. He was just hurt and angry, and he didn't know how to separate those feelings from everything else. Sophie's voice broke as she told him he was still her dad. The DNA didn't change that, and in that moment, Michael felt something crack inside him. Because she was right. DNA might say he wasn't their father, but he'd been there for every first step, every lost tooth, every nightmare. He'd been the one to teach James to ride a bike, to help Sophie with her math homework, to read bedtime stories to Emma. Catherine had stolen that from him. She'd poisoned it with her lies, but the memories were still real, even if the foundation was false. Michael told Sophie he knew and that he was sorry for all of this. They sat together in silence, and Michael realized that his revenge, satisfying as it had been, had cost him something too. He'd won the legal battles. He'd destroyed Catherine financially. But he'd also lost 3 kids he'd loved and who had loved him. In the end, Michael did maintain a relationship with the children, though it was strained and complicated. Catherine struggled financially, working 2 jobs to pay back the money she owed. Marcus was in the kids' lives now, trying to be a father to 3 children who barely knew him. Michael dated occasionally, but found it hard to trust anyone. His business thrived. He threw himself into work with a fervor that bordered on obsessive. He bought a smaller house, something that didn't echo with the ghosts of his former life. Sometimes, late at night, he wondered if it had been worth it. The revenge, the legal victories, the complete destruction of Catherine's life. He'd proven his point. He'd made her pay for what she'd done. But the cost had been steep, measured not in money, but in something far more valuable. Still, when he looked at those DNA results, tucked away in his desk drawer, he knew he'd do it all again. Because some betrayals are too deep to forgive, some lies too fundamental to overlook. Catherine had stolen 15 years of his life, and he'd made sure she'd never forget the price of that theft. That was his revenge. Complete, total, and utterly devastating. And if people thought he was heartless for it, well, they hadn't been the ones living a lie for 15 years. They hadn't been the ones who'd opened that envelope and watched their entire world crumble into dust. Michael Richardson had been a fool once. He'd believed in love, in trust, in the sanctity of family. Catherine had taught him better. And the lesson she'd learned in return was simple. Betray a good man, and he might just become someone you should have feared all along.